Hello and welcome to All Things Policy, your daily podcast on news, public policy, world affairs, economic policy, technology policy, and the world that's around it. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Aditya Ramanathan. Aditya, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Aditya. I head Takstashila's Advanced Military Technologies and Outer Space practice, and glad to be here, Manoj.
So today what we're going to do is that we thought we'd take stock of the last 7 weeks. There's lots that's happened ever since Donald Trump has come to power. And lots that's changed and lots that's in flux. So we thought we'd just take stock of what's happened and what that means to the world and what that means to India's foreign policy and Indian interests. So Aditya, I want to begin by basically asking you, 7 weeks, tremendous chaos. What's your big takeaways? What are the trend lines that you're seeing emerging?
The biggest impression that I get is uncertainty. There's uncertainty within the American system, and there's uncertainty for countries elsewhere. There's uncertainty for American allies, for American partners like India, as well as adversaries of the United States. And I think this this uncertainty is partly by design. I think it's partly meant to put countries off guard and to make them, in a sense, as Donald Trump would see it, not think that they can take the United States for granted or take it for a ride. But it's also just partly because this administration is settling in. It hasn't found its groove yet. It doesn't know where it's going from here. So I think that part will settle down. Some natural constraints will start being felt around American actions, American behavior. But a great deal of uncertainty remains, and that's really because at its heart, in some ways, this is not an America we're quite used to.
Yeah.
I'd argue that this is not quite an aberration. That in a sense, Donald Trump does represent a particular tradition in American foreign affairs. But we've not seen anything like this in our lifetimes. We certainly haven't seen anything like this since 1945. So it's going to take some getting used to. But Manoj, I'd like to ask you, because I'm really curious about this. What does this mean for the U.S. itself? I mean, how does this play in U.S. Domestic politics, and how does the U.S. foreign policy establishment see these rather dizzying developments of the last 7 weeks?
Yeah, it's quite crazy, right? I mean, everybody knew that Trump's coming to power since November 5th last year. He had quite literally said what to expect. I think it makes me think of that movie Don't Look Up, where the asteroid is coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, and you still are unable to prepare for it. And even then, when things happen, they are shocking in some way. So, I mean, every time you listen to American analysts, particularly of the Democrat-leaning variety, and you'll hear them talk about how what's happening is shocking but not surprising. And I think that is somewhere where domestically the system is at right now, where there is a shock to the system. And it's not a surprise because you were expecting that. I presume to some Trump voters it has been a surprise, because if you look around, you will see a lot of Republican voters who are really angry. You're seeing town halls being held, and you're seeing Republican congressmen running away from town halls, being pushed back against. There's lots of frustration with the lawmakers. And the public, I think, there's a certain realization that, yes, you don't like a bloated government, which is what he promised that he would cut. But as he's cutting indiscriminately in some way, it's also having downstream effects on people's lives, on their daily lives, and the kind of assistance that they would receive, the kind of programs that they had, and all that's creating a certain degree of resentment. Obviously, there's no immediate vent for those electorally. We'll have to wait essentially till the midterms next year in November for any assessment of the actual impact. But if you were to look at sort of simple metrics like the stock market in the US, the Dow Jones yesterday suffered one of its worst falls, 1,000-point decline. And it's having a downstream effect on all our portfolios in India also. So I think that is something there's a frustration around that, the idea that you were voted in, yes, to cut government, but also to deal with prices and inflation, and that's not really happened. And now, in fact, the messaging from the administration is that there's going to be some more pain, and because we are trying to engender this big transition, and it's going to be some more pain. And I'm not sure how much patience people will have for that when that is, when that is accompanied by such chaos, particularly in terms of foreign policy. I think on the foreign policy piece. I think that there is, like you said rightly, that there is this debate within America about what America's position in the world should be. I think there are people who are deeply frustrated with the idea that America should be the world's policeman. They're frustrated with these commitments abroad. There are also people who believe that at the same time America has to be engaged globally because it has a unique role in some way, but it also has interests. And then there are people who are from the isolationist variety who say, hey, look, we've got two oceans on either side. We're fine. Nothing's going to bother us. And I think you saw a sense of that frustration in Vladimir Zelensky's voice at that infamous meeting in the Oval Office where he said that you think you have oceans and you'll be safe, right? So I think that he's picking up on a strand of this thing. The fascinating thing that I find about this debate internally is I don't think in India particularly, we've actually had a serious look at what does this make America great again, the MAGA movement mean? Is there a core ideology? Is it a cult of personality, and once the personality goes, the movement dissipates? Or is it something more? I fathom that, from the way I understand it, I reckon that there is a deeper movement. And the deeper movement has different strands of thought. One of them is isolationism, but one of them is revolution. And that revolution requires the United States to be engaged externally. And J.D. Vance's speech at Munich, I think, captured that revolutionary element. He was basically telling Europe that we're not abandoning you. You've abandoned some core values, which now our movement represents. And we would like you to replicate what we've done back home, and that was essentially a call to right-wing parties in Europe. So therefore, it's not necessarily an abandonment of allies, although the traditional alliance structure is under strain. So that's how, I think of what's happening domestically within America, where there is frustration, but there is also this undercurrent of ideological change. And with that, you've looked at Europe, right? You've looked at the alliance system. I think that there is a certain frustration within Europe. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. How are America's allies looking at this change in American foreign policy, and also Russia? How's Russia looking at that change?
That's really interesting. Europe's, really Western Europe is so accustomed to American support that they actually don't know of a life without it. And this has been going on for something like 3 generations, right? So there isn't even a political class or a class among the bureaucracy, among the armed forces in these countries that understand what a world without the United States looks like.
Yeah.
This has been a constant fear, and every time this fear has come up in the past, the Europeans have always said that they're deeply committed to European independence or autonomy in decision making and so on, but nothing has really happened. And sometimes it's because Europe has itself had to deal with crises in 1991 or 1989 to 1991, when you had German reunification. People were afraid about a unified Germany, but actually Germany was so self-absorbed in that whole process of reunification that this wasn't a country that was projecting power across Europe or anything like that, right? Those fears were misplaced. And after that, you did have the whole business of European unification, and that again that experienced a crisis in around 2010 with the sovereign bond crisis. So Euro crisis, German reunification, and now the war in Ukraine have all sort of come up, and I think for Europeans, none of this has so far catalyzed a fundamental change in behavior.
Yeah.
You have now seen Europeans saying, yes, we're willing to provide. For the last 3 years, they've been providing arms to Ukraine. But that's like, you'd expect it's the least that they would do, right?
Yeah.
No, it's a little different in Eastern Europe, especially with some of the countries that border Russia. Poland, for example. Their attitude is different. These countries are also more tied to the United States. They seem to value that relationship more. A lot of these countries, even have been willing to support unpopular American decisions, like for example the decision to go into Iraq in 2003. As part of the sort of deal of being part of NATO, of being part of this defensive alliance. So I think for the Europeans, I'm not going to hold my breath expecting big changes. I think it's really hard for them to change. For Russia, I don't know, if I was Russian, I'd be surprised too. I would be surprised that things have
And pleasantly so.
Yeah, pleasantly so.
Yeah.
That things have moved so fast, so quickly.
Yeah.
What's sort of disconcerting about the whole business with Zelensky and with Ukraine is not that, for example, from an Indian point of view, we don't want peace. We do want that. Our ideal outcome would be a durable peace in Europe that will allow America to do other things, right?
Yeah.
Also, we don't want constant hostility between the West and Russia.
Yeah.
What's sort of disconcerting is that this is not the way great powers behave, right? So if that's not the script they're going to follow, the US is going to follow. How does that translate into, say, actions in the Indo-Pacific? How does that translate into India-US relations? It's a little disconcerting there. And of course, there's also the less important question of, does the US actually respect the sovereignty of other countries?
Yeah.
So if, for example, if India's sovereignty is violated, how seriously does the US take that?
Yeah.
And that's unclear as well. So I think it's been a bit, like I said, it's uncertain. We're all still trying to figure out what to expect from all of this. But in terms of the alliance system, I don't think anybody in Europe actually believes that Trump is going to honor Article 5.
Yeah.
And I think that is the single biggest political risk in Europe today.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, right? Because he himself a couple of days ago said that, if we are attacked, do you think the Europeans will honor Article 5? And that was obviously nonsensical, because history has shown that the Europeans did. When the only time that Article 5 was invoked was after 9/11, and the Europeans did. The other aspect of this is that the extent to which the United States, I think that there is a certain amount of tension that while is the goal burden sharing, or is the goal abandoning and retreating? Because I can see why he tried burden sharing the last time he was in power. Biden also and the rest also talked about it, but obviously not in the tones that Trump talks about it. And you were not able to mobilize sufficient amount of, European capital to do that. Now he's saying that, look, he's probably wielding a bigger stake and saying, I'm done unless you do much more. And I remember that when, in the early days of his administration, particularly when he met with Macron and Macron was in DC, there was this conversation that, well, everybody around the world is essentially calibrated how to approach him, which is, let's offer early, easy wins which are low cost, in the hope that any of the adverse consequences of his policies, any of these really adverse policies, can get kicked down the road. And if you can kick it sufficiently down the road, firstly by offering certain kinds of concessions, which may not be very high cost. Secondly, by making sure that policies get stuck in processes. So there's a 100-day review on the economy, an additional review and things like that. And you drag the conversation long until you see some of the adverse consequences of the policies play out in the domestic economy, or the idea of this uncertainty play out in the domestic economy, which then forces a rethink saying, hey, look, okay, I can't do this. I can't do like 60% tariffs and things like that. I need to do something lesser than that because I've made these commitments. Or I need to see if I can get some more low cost but high symbolic value concessions. And so I can continue saying that, look, I'm winning, but I'm, so while Trump is not getting much, but I'm also not conceding much as a other country, while the alliance and the rest of it remains intact. That was, I think, the initial thinking. And it was not just the thinking from the European side, it was also thinking from the Chinese side. And I presume it was also thinking from Delhi's side, where you saw changes in our tariffs, particularly during the budget, and subsequently also now the Indian Commerce Minister was in DC. So that's also been the thinking that if you can do some early low-cost concessions, you might be able to hold off on the really bad things that might come. I'm we can see the domestic economy being hurt now. We can see the American economy being hurt. But I'm not certain if there is enough, if he's lost enough political capital anytime soon, or he's likely to lose enough political capital anytime soon, to try and roll back some of the things that he's doing with the rest of them. Which means that countries around the world, whether it is the Europeans, whether it is India, whether it is South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, will have to do some degree of de-risking from the US itself. And that puts strain on the alliance structure. And it also puts strain on, say, countries that are looking to partner with the US to deal with China, right? And I think that's a fascinating dynamic. On Russia, I hadn't, I wanted to get your thoughts on the idea that Trump might propose a deal. They're entering these dialogues. They had this dialogue between the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister in Saudi Arabia. There will be more talks. He clearly wants a deal to end this war in one way or the other. I want to first talk to you about two things first on that thing. Firstly, what are the chances of Russia actually buying a deal, given that the US is so polarized? So that's my first question. Like, what's the chances of Putin buying a deal and saying this is going to stick? And secondly, the argument that Trump has made is that, hey, look, we'll get Ukrainian mineral rights, we'll have American companies invested in Ukraine, and that's a bigger security guarantee than having American forces committed in Ukraine. So on those two things, how do you think about those two things?
Well, on the first one, take this with a whole bag of salt, because we don't know how things will actually play out. But I think that the ask at this point may be more modest, which is simply having a ceasefire. And a ceasefire, the thing about a ceasefire is that you can always reverse the ceasefire, you can always end the ceasefire. It doesn't necessarily have to be a broader political deal. Broader political deal will actually require more buy-in from the US, broader government, including the legislature. It will require a buy-in from at least some Ukrainians, and it will also ultimately require buy-in from other countries in Europe. And I think the Russians understand that. But in the interim, if I was Russia, I think I would be happy with some kind of ceasefire that is reasonably favorable to me at this stage, because that essentially helps solidify the lines, right? So while Russia didn't actually get what it wanted when it set out with this war in February 2022, it will have gains to show, and Putin can walk away from it without feeling potentially humiliated. So I suspect if there's a deal, it will be something along those lines. Your second question was, sorry.
American companies being invested in Ukraine being a bigger security guarantee than American military being there.
Yeah, I don't buy that. In fact, it may actually. It may be the worst of both worlds, because they're not necessarily a tripwire. Just having a battalion of soldiers is a tripwire. But having American companies there is, people can just move capital. Can just move it instantly. And on the other hand, it can be seen once again by Russia as American investment. This can be seen as a sort of American influence in Ukraine, right? And the Russians may not be terribly happy about that. So I'm a bit skeptical about how that would play out.
Yeah, I mean, I found that fascinating. It was in one of the groups that we had this conversation, and I heard from some of my colleagues in India who were very excited at the idea, saying, well, that's a very sensible solution. And I was like, no, I think we are just used to too many master strokes. And this is sounding like something like that. So let's not buy into something like this, because the Europeans are not buying, right? That unless you have American boots on the ground, it's not going to function. Another related thing, and you sort of talked about this earlier when you talked about in your early response about Trump, and you talked about how, there are questions about how the US would behave in the Indo-Pacific vis-a-vis China also in particular. I recall that when Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, when he was speaking at the Ukraine Contact Group, his first visit to Europe, he said that, look, we're not going to deal with the Russians anymore from a security point of view, because we have bigger fish to fry, which is dealing with China in the Indo-Pacific. And somewhere he was sort of suggesting, although very badly so, a division of labor between the transatlantic alliance, that you deal with Russia, Europeans, you deal with Russia, and we deal with the Indo-Pacific. In that context, and there's been lots of debate about, whether the theaters are combined, whether actions in one impact the other. I am of the view that, in a certain sense, yes, there is an interlinkage between the theaters. So, as much as when the war in Ukraine started, the Indian government said that, hey, look, we really have nothing to do with this war, and it's not in our immediate periphery, so it doesn't really impact us. But it was not very much later that we realized that there is tremendous downstream impacts from an economic point of view, food, fertilizer, so on and so forth, even credit, to a military point of view in terms of supplies that we were getting from Russia, to our strategic relationship with Russians in the United States. Likewise for the Chinese, there has been an impact across the board. What do you think of this idea of these theaters being either linked or delinked? Do you see a linkage, or do you see that there can be a neat bifurcation of this sort?
I don't think you can bifurcate. I think these sectors are inherently linked, and they're linked by economics, they're linked by politics, and we've seen this in past great power confrontations, wars as well, right? All of these sectors are interlinked. But you can do burden sharing, and it's not an unreasonable ask for the United States, and this is not limited to Trump. Americans have been trying to do this for a while, to tell the Europeans to actually take on more of this burden for themselves. In many ways, we would in India welcome that, if the US can divest itself of some of the over involvement it has both in Europe and in the Middle East and West Asia, and be able to focus on the challenges in Asia. My concern is how you do it, and that's not an easy answer, because if you divest yourself too much, you can create problems in the future. We don't talk about terrorism much in the last 5 years, but the risk of mass casualty terrorism hasn't gone away. It's there, right? It never went away. So those risks always exist. Similarly with Europe, NATO isn't just about deterring Russia. If that were the case, really, it would have, as many people assumed in the 90s, basically dissolved. Right? But it didn't. And I think the reason for that is really NATO is also, the old sort of adage about NATO is that it's about keeping the Americans in, keeping the Russians out, and keeping the Germans down. And those first two kind of hold, right? So because ultimately Europe, it's really Europe that has experienced this period of remarkable peace, right, since 1945. I mean, of course, you have the Cold War, and that's not nothing. But in general, it had very few land wars. And the reason for that isn't because Europeans suddenly became enlightened. I mean, it's really because you have these external actors, the Soviet Union and the United States, coming and imposing some sort of order there. And so Americans do have to wonder what happens if they divest themselves of Europe too much, right? Ultimately, how long is it before Europeans start turning on each other? So I think that's a major issue. There's also a lot of, I think, people are a little too sanguine about the spread of nuclear weapons. My belief is that this is more complicated than that. So, the simplistic idea is, well, a bunch of countries in Europe will acquire nuclear weapons and things will be perfectly fine. Unfortunately, that's not how anything actually works in reality. And I mean, just look at it. For example, if Poland were to acquire nuclear weapons, what would it mean for Poland? First, you have the race to acquire nuclear weapons, right? The period in which you are getting them. Why do you believe that Russia is going to do nothing during that period of several years, right? You're basically creating a sort of window of opportunity for the Russians. Second, nuclear weapons themselves create problems, right? Because you have to make sure they're survivable, and if you're trying to deter Russia, that's not a small ask. So if you have to invest massively in your nuclear forces, you need conventional forces to protect those. And what opportunity cost does it create? To be able to develop conventional deterrence against Russia. And then you finally have to think about what other European countries are going to think about your growing nuclear arsenal, right? So there's all of this is going to actually create new problems of its own. That I'm not sure. That I think Americans who support this kind of policy, the Trump's approach I think they're discounting those risks.
Yeah.
So that's the key risk I think with nuclear weapons. The other thing is nuclear weapons will not deter everything.
Yeah.
Right. So what if so sure Soviet tanks can't roll into Warsaw like it's 1939, but they can just take a chunk of Polish territory,
Yeah.
right? And what are you going to do then?
Yeah.
If you think nuclear weapons deter countries from mounting conventional attacks, you should tell that to the Ukrainians who took Kursk from Russia. Right?
Absolutely.
So it doesn't work like that. So there are all of these things that that I think to me highlight that there are no easy solutions. There's no easy solution that's going to help keep European peace, and there's no real replacement for a major power.
Yes. Yeah, and I also feel that from a reputational point of view, and I think this is some sort of a hard reality which will probably hit the United States after this process, however this process plays out. But if in case Trump's policy allows Europe or enables Europe, and Europe can get its act together, and they're able to build sufficient power capabilities, spend more on defense, perhaps become more united. If there is a united sort of European army of whatever kind, although that's a long, long way away. But if Europe can get its act together to that extent, the analogy that comes to mind is, as a parent, you want your child to grow up and do things and take more responsibility, be more independent. And this is my frustration speaking. But at the same time, the moment your child starts to take more responsibility and is much more aware of their sense of authority evolving, they don't listen to you as much anymore. And that's not necessarily a nice feeling to get used to, right? So I think that is also something where, if I remember, and I'm sure you remember this too, that in 2003 when the US was, the Bush administration wanted to go into Iraq, and it was the French and the Germans who would push back. And I think it was the German foreign minister at that point in time who had, or it was the German defense minister who scolded Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense, about, well, you keep saying democracy, democracy, my country does not agree to this war. And that was one of those pre-TikTok era viral things. I think you see a lot more of that if Europe can get its act together to say no to the United States. And if the US, if right now it finds that it wants to burden share, it wants countries to do more. The moment countries do more, they will push back on American agenda, and that will expose the limits of American power further. So if the US wants to become a normal country and not the global hegemon, fair enough. It'll live with those frustrations. But if it believes that those superpower status must still endow it with certain authority, which others should not challenge, that will diminish quite significantly as others. So if it finds India's pushing back on things annoying, wait till Europe gets its act together, and then when the Europeans push back, I think that will be really annoying.
Oh, absolutely. Americans are not used to other countries talking back to them.
Precisely.
So this would be a very novel experience, no matter who's in power in the United States. Going back to your earlier point about how a lot of this is being driven by US domestic politics, and this isn't just on the right, it's on the left as well. And the sort of quip I have about this is that Americans love having the benefits of empire, but don't want to pay the costs.
Yeah.
Right? So even if you're Bernie Sanders, you imagine that you can continue basically massive social spending, which ultimately depends on the US dollar's dominance and America's ability to run up a massive debt cheaply. But you don't want the burdens of empire, right? And unfortunately, that free lunch isn't going to be there. And so Americans, there are some hard decisions here for Americans to make. Americans are not used to being a normal country. A normal country is India worrying about what's happening in its LAC. A normal country worries about other countries being more powerful than it. These are not things America has been used to in something like 150 years. So there's no script for it. I think that Americans are going to find that they don't like where this is going fairly quickly. And I think that's ultimately going to be one of those things that bound the actions of the Trump administration. Having said that, I don't buy the idea that Donald Trump is a complete aberration. If he was the first thing that Joe Biden would have done when he came to power in 2021 is to reverse every single one of Donald Trump's policies. They didn't do that. They kept the parts that they liked. The United States has become more protectionist. The Inflation Reduction Act is really a massive protectionist measure. They've been following industrial policy of the sort that Donald Trump would actually broadly like, even though you won't get him to admit it. So there's this, I think, speaks to a more fundamental change in the United States, where American leaders have decided that they are going to try and follow a foreign policy that breeds less domestic opposition, and also is more sustainable. I think that course correction is happening, and I'd go so far as to argue that Donald Trump is potentially a transformative American president. And what I mean in the sense is that in the last century, we've seen sort of three big transformations. The first came after 1929 with the Great Depression. You had FDR come to power in 32, and the New Deal. And the New Deal really rewired American economics. It put in place a lot of regulation. It created the FDIC, which is Deposit Insurance Glass-Steagall Act, created the Securities and Exchange Commission, and more importantly, it did things like sort of move the balance of power to labor from industrialists, right? And then the second part of this was after 1945, when the United States set up its, the multilateral institutions and became the dominant power in the world. And that system continued until sometime in the 1970s. By the 70s, you could see giving away. The United States stopped pretending that it was pegging the dollar to gold. You had the oil crisis. And that's the period in which you have a global transformation to what was, at least until recently, our era, right? Which is the era of globalization and capitalism. And this wasn't a purely American phenomenon. Yes, it started with Jimmy Carter, who began deregulation, and then, of course, Ronald Reagan. But you also had Maggie Thatcher coming to power in the UK, and you also had Deng Xiaoping, right? So these were big changes. I'd argue that even during emergency, India started having less ideological budgets, right? So things were slowly moving all around the world, and you had this period of globalization, which especially after the end of the Cold War, boomed, and it came to a sort of, it perhaps suffered a fatal blow in 2008 with the financial crisis, but it's limped on since then. But I think any pretense that it's business as usual ended after maybe the pandemic, perhaps a little before that. And I think that we're seeing, the US is in a position where it's going to change its political economy quite fundamentally. And we don't know what shape that will take yet, and it's probably a process that will take a decade or more. But that is going to fundamentally shape India's choices, India's freedom of action, and also India's ability to grow.
Fantastic. So last question. So far, so good, Donald Trump for India? Although the future is uncertain, so far, so good?
Well, yes, in a narrow sense. I want to know what happens with tariffs. I want to know how antagonistic our trade relationship becomes. But yes, no catastrophes so far.
So that's a low bar that we've set. But so far, so good, right? I mean, we've been able to have one successful state visit, which allowed at least the broad technology relationship to continue. The trade relationship will be disrupted with tariffs. But it seems like from a security point of view, the relationship is still strong. Trump's first term was good for India from a security point of view. So far, so good in that sense. Even on tariffs, while you're going to see reciprocal tariffs, and there will be some hiccups in domains, it's likely that we manage that with a bilateral deal, or at least that's the hope, I think.
Yes.
But then again, I think in saying that, it's useful to keep in mind that if he changes the world order and the structure of the world, your bilateral relationship is useful, but if the world around you starts to crumble, you're not really going to do much with that bilateral relationship. It'll be some succor, but it's not going to necessarily overall benefit you, right? So the strategic effect might be far greater than that limited relationship. Do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
All right. So at least we have agreement on that. With that, thank you so much, Aditya, for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
And this has been fascinating. We've tried to give you an Indian perspective, or not just an Indian perspective, a broader perspective on what we think has happened over the last 7 to 8 weeks in the Trump administration. And we'll certainly visit this again because he's somebody who keeps making news.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.